CORS error. CORS errors are based off of basically like you're working off of a local development versus integrating with a live server. And sometimes if the headers of the request aren't matching, you'll get that. But you'll go into that, I think, a little bit more in detail later on. That's a bit more advanced. But if there's specific error for feel free to post. Will React hooks deprecate classes or depreciate? Sorry. I think they're both still useful for their own thing. I don't know if that's React's goal. I think some people on the interwebs are like leaning towards React hooks taking over. There are a lot of like diehard class fans though, because it is traditional JavaScript, so people feel like they have a lot more flexibility if they're integrating with the class versus integrating with React hooks. React hooks create a lot of magic boxes where you insert values and things are just handled for you. That feels a lot more frameworky, whereas React was originally created as a like supplemental library. So that kind of gets into the weeds of the philosophy of React and whether or not to use it. So we'll see. I think it'll definitely become very popular and very used as a default, whereas classes will come for these like specialization components that are a lot more custom, a lot more complex. Okay, sorry about that delay. I am going to head into our material for the night. We are working with single page applications this week and next. Single page applications we'll go into a little bit more, but primarily we'll be looking at React Router and Formic and Forms as well. We will be using or studying what client-side routing is versus server-side rendering, and we'll be able to create single-page applications and also know what that means. So this week is all about React Router. We have React Router 1 and 2, basically going over how to implement a basic routing system today, and then something a little bit more complex on Thursday. So today's objectives, first we're going to start with some single page application work, what that means. And I want to start off by talking about client-side routing. I want to see, well, first, let's see, what is a single page application? So if you are knowing what I'm saying when I'm saying SPA is a single page application, add it to the thread here in Slack. And also, if you don't know, feel free to like send me a cool emoji, maybe a technical error emoji if there's one applicable. And I'll go ahead and share my screen before I forget. Any guesses? It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to be right too. So a page that doesn't reload when something on it changes. Single endpoint that updates as necessary to achieve a specific view. Designed for faster loading times. When different things render depending on the link you press without a network request. Yeah, that's a great summary, Jordan. An app that has a single page. Nice. An SPA is where you can change the URL and page content without having to activate a network call. Yeah, that's right, Sarah. So displaying conditionally. Facebook, Gmail, Twitter, I don't know exactly what they use, but perhaps, yeah. So yeah, a single page application is a web application or website. So web application or website that interacts with the user by dynamically rewriting the current page rather than loading an entire new page from the server. So remember, I think it was our very first class, we were talking about like bringing in code from a server and how that is rendered into our DOM, and our DOM displays it within our browser. And that takes a process, right? We have to communicate with the server. Sometimes we're passing credentials like you guys are doing with those API tokens. So where there's some sort of like authentication with the server, then you're actually getting the data. Then you're absorbing whatever's returned. Then you're putting that into your React code. Then like triggers an update. And then, you know, like it just goes on and on and on. Whereas with a single page application server, we're not having to do the first half of that. And because we're not doing that first half of it, then we have to figure out a way that mocks a server interaction to pull down these different pages. But it ends up being very responsive. And thank goodness for React Router that we don't have to spend time figuring out how to do this. So as some of you guys might have mentioned, it is rewriting the current page. It is dynamically updating the page without rendering from the server. So I wanted to show a comparison of server side, which is pulling in code from a server and then rendering to your screen, versus client side. So actually a lot of your TK pages are server side rendered. You'll see as you click to different pages, there's a new URL that's hit. There's a reloading process with a white screen, and then the code is rendered from their server onto our browser screen. So server side, the biggest giveaway is that big white page flash in front of your face. It's a little bit jarring. You can see that it takes some time to load. Versus if we see a single page application, I don't know if you guys went to Dan's talk on Friday. It's amazing, but he mentioned this website in particular, so I was clicking around with it. It is client-side rendering, and you can see that as I'm clicking on these different links, the content below changes. It changes to the About Me, the articles, her contact page. The URL is updating too, so if you watch the URLs I'm clicking through, it is changing. But notice that even though the URL is changing, the page isn't flashing white and then rendering something from a server. There's no loading process. We can see that a little bit more clearly with our inspect tools. So you'll see as I'm clicking around, calls are made because we're pulling back new data, but it's not resetting our network requests in any way. It's not, it's just getting data. It's not, or sending data actually in this case to Google Analytics, but it's not like pulling in full server pages. Whereas with React Router, when we're on our network request, we can see that when we click to a new page, we are pulling in all sorts of data and images. Specifically, we are pulling in, see if I can find it. I don't think I can find it off the top of my head. But we're pulling in server code, which is why we get the flash and why there's so much going on here. And pulling in all these different libraries and whatnot, they're not preloaded onto our screen. It's something that we have to get access to from the server. So that's a little bit of an example of server side with our TK and a client side rendering with Tanya's website. Tanya's website, I realized this right before class, is not React Router. However, this shows you that there are many different ways to implement a single page application. So a single page application is using client-side routing. These are your terminologies, right? A single page application is implemented using client-side routing, and you can implement client-side routing with a number of tools, one of which is React Router. So tonight we're going to go over React Router, not switch. We'll be going over the browser router, and we'll do so in our guided project. So I'll go ahead and send out a link for you guys. Links in Slack. Go ahead and fork it and make it your own. So tonight's goal is to create some links. I'll actually just show you, whoops, I'll show you the solution code that we'll be working with. So this is, by the end of class, this is what we're going to have completed. We'll have some navigation links, just like we saw with Tanya's website where she had an about me and a contact in her blog link. We'll create some links of our own in our nav bar, one of which will be home and one will be shop. We'll also pull in an image here, and when we go to the shop link, we'll see a bunch of different items inside of our shop link. And each item is clickable, so that if we click on an item, it will pull up that image and a little bit more information about this. Cool. So here in our index.js, I want to give us like a brief overview of where everything's living. We have a div that's going to hold our navigation links, and we are also bridging the gap between our HTML div with the ID of root and our app code, which is here. So normally we have app broken out into a separate component, but this time it's in the index.js file. We also have a data.js file. This is where we're going to see a lot of that data that had the cute dinosaur tacos. Still like holding out for one of my students to get me those. I have an array here with objects. Each object has a URL. It also has a description, shipping information, and a price and an ID. So instead of, excuse me, instead of pulling from an API, this evening we'll be using static data found in our data.js file in source. And then for components, for each one in here, we have a home JS component. This is going to be our home view that we'll implement, we'll display using React Router. Our item component, this is what's going to have that cute dinosaur image in it. It'll also have information about the pricing and the description of the item once you click on the item in the shop. And then the shop.js is going to use all the items that are in our data and create those item cards that we saw on the shop page. So, React Router. Here's the docs if you want to follow along, or just feel free to watch my screen for going over React Router. It'll be useful to have that website though as you guys get into your homework. Like you guys are doing with Create React App, you can create React App with the browsing kind of built in. If you want to learn how to do that, that's a part of the Quick Start page. If you already have an application built out, or if you just want to pull in React Router, you can do an npm install or a yarn add of the React Router DOM library. I heard some of you had a little bit of trouble knowing when to run npm install or yarn install. Hopefully you figured out that you can only run those commands whenever you're in the same directory as your package.json file. So those commands look for that file in order to see which dependencies you want to pull into your application, kind of like a downloading file. So in this case, if we did npm install, it would install React Router DOM. It would add it to our package.json, and then we would we'll be able to use it to implement. So the first one that we're going to be using today is the browser router as router. So who has seen this layout? What can people tell me? What is browser router? If you don't know, send me an emoji. It's such an aggressive dance. Oh my God, no clown face. Dependency to create links, component router that gives us access to use the rest of the React router library, routes to link, history API component, always routing from inside the SPA, like a package extension, websites that may only be compatible with specific rendering. No one's quite hit it yet. It is a component router that gives us access to use the library. It's a little bit tricky. So this is another syntax that we haven't quite used before. Previously, we've only been importing using the curly braces for the name of the specific import. So when we use named imports, we're only using the name of the constant that's been exported when we're importing it inside of the curly braces. In this instance, we're using the name of the named export, which is browser router, and then we're renaming it as router. So this isn't something that like many people do or that all that often. However, there are a few cases where people like to do it. This one, people like to do it because it's easier to read. It's also shorter to type, so people aren't typing it as much. It's convention to look for router rather than browser router. Initially, when React Router was created, it was just router. So a lot of functionality, like a lot of like blogs or whatever that help you Stack Overflow. Some of them haven't been updated to say browser router. So this is a hack around that, is to do browser router as router. You might see with any other name to export or import. You can try it out for yourself on some of our old projects to see how it works. But yeah, I just wanted to call that syntax out. So we'll be using that inside of our code. If we go to our index.js file, we see that React Router DOM is already installed in our dependencies. We've added it as a dependency. Double check to make sure yours is added like that as well. Then we need to import our library in order to be able to use it. So we're going to use that new syntax. So browser router as router from React Router DOM. Oops. And then we're going to use router inside of our component. So we want to wrap our entire application in the router. Sorry, that syntax highlighting was throwing me off a little bit. It looked like an error, but it's not. So we want to wrap our entire application inside of the router. The reason for this is what makes it a single page application. Basically, our entire application is now going to be, all of its navigation is now going to be handled by the router library. And in order for our entire application to be handled by this library, we need to wrap it inside of that library. So whenever I'm saying wrap, I mean putting contents inside of our JSX brackets. So we're not passing it as a prop, we're actually passing it as a child, which you'll learn a little bit more about in the advanced React. But for now, know that in order to have the React router working across all the way, all over your application, you need to wrap your app component with the router component. So the router is what we've renamed browser router as. So if you want to see documentation about the browser router, we can find it on this left-hand sidebar here. And this will give us a little bit more information about browser router as a component. So we're going to use, in order to get our navigation working, there's a couple key things here that we need to point out. One is that we need to create links. So links are React Router's version of the A tag. They're called capital L, link. And in order for links to work, we need to create like a landing base for them. So those are called routes. So links are the action component. That's what the user's interacting with. And the route is what's instructing the router to handle whenever somebody clicks on a link. So we're going to create a route. Route is another named import from React Router DOM. And notice how they're creating routes. We're going to add them inside of our app component. There are a couple of things that we see here that we're going to use. One is naming route as a component. And then two, we see this path piece. So path is saying whenever this URL is navigated to, then we're going to render something. So let's see it with our home component. If we go back to our index.js file, I'm going to add another import here for the component route. And then I'm going to create a route with a path equal to the string just slash. And I'm going to render a component home. So it says home is not defined. I also need to import home. From ./component/home. Okay, what's happening here? So we've created a route that says whenever our browser says we're at this URL, which is just the slash, which means that little guy there, or as a browser default also, if that backslash isn't present, that will also still render as a slash for a router. And we're saying whenever we're at this URL, the path, then I'm going to render our home component. And notice that when we're importing home just like we're doing anytime we use home or that component as a JSX element. We're just doing our default import with the name home, capital H. And then we're passing that component, no functions or any special JSX notation or anything like that. We're passing home as a component to the component prop of route. So what that does is whenever we hit this URL, it then renders whatever component that we pass through, home. This is a key part of React Router, so I just want to pause here and ask for any clarifying questions, or give me a thumbs up or thumbs down if things are going well or bad, respectively. Why are we passing the route into the component of app instead of into the router component with app as a child? So I've done it a number of ways. I think the app level or the router level is both acceptable. You'll also see people having a routes component that they import into their app as a way of like breaking out routes from the app. There are a lot of different conventions you can follow, but you don't need to have them here because they are still a subcomponent of the router. So it doesn't need to be the exact child. It can be like a grandchild of the router and still render correctly. I wouldn't go much deeper than app except for an additional component for routes. So if you were to break things off into its own separate page, sometimes people do a routes component that they import into app. Best practice is have it high up, but no one is really like saying that you need to have it in one place or another. Devin, go over which part. I can go over just the flow of route one more time. Okay. So the flow of routes. So far what we have is a router that wraps our app component. We do so that our entire app is now, the navigation is now maintained within our router library. We've imported browser router, but we've named it router, which is why the documentation is for browser router. However, router is the new name that the alias that we have just given to our JSX. Inside of the router, in our app component, we have declared a route. A route is a landing point. So whenever someone changes navigation up here in the browser to a link, that path matches to pass in our route. So currently we're matching this route, which is the / route. Whenever our path of a route is matched, the React router will then render the home component. So at this point, our home component is this image with the little button down here, and that is rendering because we were at the / path. Cool. Let's continue. Let's create another route here. We're going to do so for another link that will create shop. So we're going to import our shop component first from components / shop. And then we're going to create another route here. And that'll be for whenever someone goes to the / shop URL. So when someone goes to the / shop path, we want to render the shop component. Whoops. All right, I guess I should show you guys that. Okay, so I left some old code in here. I wasn't anticipating this, but we'll dive on in. Currently shop, we'll have to update the code together. So currently shop's not showing anything. However, that is because props.items is empty at this moment. So that's a little bit of future code that we'll come back to. For now though, let's import our items. Let us import our item. Okay, so inside of shop, we are going to have a list of items, or let's do some serious live coding here. We're going to import from our data, and it's a default export. So we'll import our items from our data file. And then we'll remove props here so that it's just rendering, oops, items. Okay. Oh, let's see. There we go. /shop. Very odd. Sorry, I'm getting some weird errors here, and I'm not quite sure why. Not a good sign. Okay. So let's go back because I had some old code in there and I want to make sure we're on the same page. When we are in shop, please make this update or copy from my code sandbox. Just recopy the shop code. I've imported our items from data, and then since it's a default export, we can just name it items without curly braces. And then I removed the props dot so that our items are coming from this data import rather than from props. Once we do that, if we look at our index.js file, so I'll leave that up there so you can make those changes. Once we do that, when we're in our index.js file, we've now created two routes. One is to go to the home path / and one is to go to this /shop URL. So if we are just in the /URL, I'm updating the URLs up here. The only thing that's rendering is our home component. Whenever I go to /shop URL, we now see a couple different things here. We have all of our different items. We have another button, which we can see in our shop code is from the shop component. And we're also seeing our home component. So remember, our home component was this big image and it has the shop now button. That's from our home component. So now we are rendering two components. We are rendering a home component and we are rendering a shop component. So can anyone tell me why we are seeing both our shop and home component at the same time? So we both have a slash. Slash is included in the URL because we're at /shop. We need to use exact path. Need to use exact. Requires exact prop. Both URLs are matching. Yeah, you guys are getting it. Yes, both are matching. So not only are we matching a slash because we have this itty bitty slash up here, which will cause our home component to render, but we are also matching subsequently /shop, which means our shop component will render. If I change the order in which our route is rendered, we will see it's now reversed. The first thing, so this is top down. We don't do a lot of things that are top down in JavaScript, so that's why I'm pointing it out. This is just like how HTML works for render order, top down, left, right-ish. Our top route, if it is /shop, will mean our shop component will render first, and then slash will also match as our second component, and so home will render on the bottom. So ultimately, we don't want this in our application. We're going to switch it, but I wanted to show you that order does matter for your rendering. So make sure you keep that in mind. But like you guys were saying, we can use the exact prop so that when we're at /shop, only the /shop component will render at this point. And that is because in order to render our home component, we must be at exactly the slash. So the only thing that we've changed here is that our home component will only render our home, because that is exactly the URL that we are referencing in our path. And if we go to /shop, we will then see just our shop component, because home will no longer match this URL. We're not writing exact equals true here. This is a shorthand that I think I used last week with you guys. So just as a reminder, exact, anytime you want to pass a Boolean value as true, you can just pass in the prop name, exact, and then they'll know that exact equals true. If you wanted to explicitly set it to false, you could use the equals in the curly braces, but exact is just a shorthand to say like exact is a true Boolean prop. And then one more thing before we go on break, I want to go over links. So as of now, I've just been updating our URL to different paths, but now I want to add a link. So we will add links inside of our nav links div here. So open that up, line 13 in index.js. And we will add a link, which is a capital L. And we'll say to /, and we know that that's going to be our home component because that's our home URL. And then we'll also add another link to equals /shop, which is the URL for our shop. And then finally, I'm going to import link, and link is also coming from the React Router DOM. So it's a component with a named import. So now we have two links up at the top, home and shop. Previously, in order to see these different pages, I was having to manually update and type in a new URL. Now I can use link to go to these new pages, and it'll just go back and forth. Notice that our nav bar is not re-rendering. Our nav bar is written in our app code. So it is above the routing of our home and shop components. Remember that top-down render order. And we are clicking two different links using the link component. So we are not using an A tag explicitly. A tags are rendered through React Router. So if you look inside of your DOM inspection, let's see if I can find it. You'll see that they are technically A tags, but we do not use A tags in our code. Can anyone tell me why I should not write an A tag when dealing with React Router? If you don't know, put an emoji or give me your best guess. It'll refresh the entire page. It doesn't interface with router, so it will refresh the page, trigger refresh. Link uses under the hood, I'm guessing using the library as the under hood. Yeah, these are all correct. If you used an A tag, and I'll show you with our home link here, if we use an A tag with an href, notice when I'm clicking shop, there's no reflash. If I click home, then it's re-rendering the whole page. If I'm doing shop, it's using the React Router code, so it navigates without that server-side rendering, and with the home, it's causing an entire re-render of the entire application because it is navigating using an A tag. So although React Router uses an A underlining, there's a lot of other logic that goes into interfacing with the React Router so that we have client-side rendering, which is why it's important to use the link component. I know I've been talking at you for a while. If you guys have any questions, feel free to ask. And then after, oh, there can be plural questions, not just the one. After going over questions, I'll give you guys a nice long break. And sorry for the little bit of the delay today. I'm getting over a cold, and also I think my computer's getting over a cold. A little bit slower today. What are the big advantages and disadvantages of using single page application versus server side? So single page applications kind of look like the new age website. Basically, it's so responsive that it's faster than blinking. That is an amazing feature for people who want really fast responsive websites. It's great for any sort of product page because it makes you look very, new age. I also think there's a lot of caching benefits for doing a single page application where you can store a lot of the information you may need, so that you only have to do like one big browser request or like 2 or 3 or whatever. And then you can cache a lot of that information and just pass it around as the user's interacting with it. So if you have some issues with broadband, I don't think that's the word I'm looking for. Correct me if I'm wrong. If you're having networking throttle issues because of like just limited network connections, like I work with a lot of people in the Navy, and so they're out on ships. There's not a lot of internet out there. So having an interaction with limited interaction to a server means that they still have a really responsive application to work with, but they're not just sitting there waiting for things to load as they're waiting for data from our server or their server to be rendered correctly. That's a huge advantage for single page applications. Server side, I think, is an excellent choice, especially if you don't have much to serve up. Very simple or static websites without a lot of that interactivity. You can get away with server side rendering. It's very common for server-side rendering for marketing pages. SEO favors server-side, especially so like when you're on Google and you do like a random search and you get like, look at all these businesses that have a similar search response. That's SEO. It just makes you Googleable, and that is a lot easier with server-side rendering, but I can't remember the specifics of why. You'll have to ask people. Do these SPAs take significantly longer on their initial load compared to traditional sites? It depends how much you're trying to load, but I haven't noticed a huge pain. And also after you load your initial page, so it's really just your first initial load for your user's browser. Any subsequent trips back, oftentimes things are cached. Libraries are cached, sometimes images are cached. Data can be cached into your local storage or cookies or something like that. But no, I don't think it takes a huge chunk of time, depending on how much data you're trying to pull in with your initial load. How does router work under the hood? Oof. Basically, it's like blocking your specific network requests, but still managing how your browser reads URLs. So it's basically like keep everything looking like it does for server-side rendering. So like you can enter normal URLs, your browser buttons for back, forward, and refresh, etc. still work. However, that's all like stored in React Router's Wonderland, where they're managing and interacting with the history API on the browser. So the history API is something we'll go into later. But yes, that's what it's based off of. Does React build responsive websites automatically? I feel like it does. Responsive websites are usually, responsive web is the idea of like as you change your browser like your website will update to it. React does not do that automatically. That's done through styles. So if there's a different question in there, please feel free to add another question. So instead of database for your SPA, you use local storage and set cookie. You'll use all of the above. Databases usually are storing long-term data. Local storage is managing like global state usually. And set cookies is passing tokens. I'm a little bit iffy on set cookies. I haven't done that in a while. When we use the route command, should we give each path its own unique path instead of how you had slash set to home, so it rendered with slash shop instead of setting it to slash home? You can. I would recommend not doing slash home. The convention is slash is home, and then using the exact path will be important there. Your URLs should be readable. Like if you read them, you would understand what's happening and what kind of data to expect. Like for instance, one of the products that I'm working on is based, is for a figure skating rink, and they have a number of different facilities, and each facility has a number of classes, and so facilities and classes both have IDs. So when I'm navigating to a specific class's information, that URL reads facility 1, class 1, so it's very readable. And that's your primary focus when you're creating URLs, something that makes sense of that content, but also gives you a sense of what data you should expect. No, SPAs are not going to replace Node. Node usually makes SPAs possible. It's slightly different there. SPA is more of like a website convention versus Node is an implementation. Can you use database client-side in SPA? You'll use Axios or some sort of promise library to access data from your database and store it inside of your client-side application. In your SPA is fine, but you can't create a database on the client. All right, bandwidth. Yes, thank you, Doug. Okay, break time. Way to push through. That was a big first hour. I'll give you guys 5 minutes, and when we come back, we will be going over dynamic links. So enjoy your break. Okay guys, come on back. So I just wanted to touch base with our objectives for this evening. We've talked about client-side routing, why it's good to use it when you would use server-side routing instead, how single-page applications are because of client-side routing. Those two go hand in hand. We added React Router into our dependencies and then into our application, wrapping our app component with the router component. Then we created two routes, one for home, one for our shop. This is so that whenever we navigated in our browser's URL, React Router was able to take whatever was in our URL path in our browser and then see if it matched any of our route's path props. If it did, then it rendered that component. It rendered those components from top to bottom. So if we have the order of our routes flip-flopped, that means that will cause a change in our rendering order on the page from top to bottom. And then we used and created a link component instead of using an A tag so that we could have client-side routing within our React Router library. We added these links to our nav bar for our both home and shop so that we can navigate between each of the routes without having to manually navigate using the browser. So without links, in order to get to those routes, we would have had to change our URL up here, but then the links just work like an A tag, except with client-side routing within React Router. So our last objective here is a little bit longer, but we're going to be talking about dynamic routing using URL parameters and what the match object is. So based on what we know with links and routes, before getting into any of the dynamic routing, it is possible to create some routes for each of our items inside of our data.js file. So our data.js file has a bunch of items. When we go to our shop, we see all these items. So right now we're thinking about, if I click one of these items, how would I have it navigate to that specific page? So what is one way we could go about creating a view or page for each of the items in the shop based off of what we know with route and link? Any ideas? Only seeing 3 replies here. Take a stab at it. It's meant to be like kind of if you had to make a creative solution without understanding dynamic URLs, what would that look like? Any other guesses? All right. So, yeah, we could create a route for each one of these individually, and then a subsequent link that whenever we clicked on that card, that link, it would be a link to that route that we've specified. So it would be a bit cumbersome, right? Because we would have to be like for each route, we would have to do route, path, and then for our first one, it would be real shop slash real viewer, and then component equals real viewer component. So somebody said create a new component for each one and then render the URL based off of that component. Yeah, but we'd have to do that for all of our items. And that's assuming that we know exactly what our items are. So we do not want to take this approach. That is because it is, one, cumbersome, two, it's not scalable. So if we're changing our data as our data is coming in, we wouldn't have that responsiveness built into our router. So this is where React router parameters come in. So instead of writing these routes individually with individual components and individual paths, we're going to be using route parameters to point to an individual item. So I kind of hinted at this before the break when we were talking about one of the projects that I'm working on, where we had a facility /1/class/1. Those ones are the IDs of the facility and the class respectively. So facility /1 means go to the information for the facility with the ID of 1. /class means then go get its class, and then /1 again means go get the first ID class at that facility number 1. So when we use route parameters in this context, we can use it for IDs. If we look at our data down here, our data has unique identifier and ID that we could use in our parameters to signal to our data which item we're working with. So if I say I want to go to the shop item 5, and then I render the item page, I can then look through our data, find the item with the ID of 5, and then use this information to populate that particular page. So that's all done through route parameters instead of creating individual components and individual paths. So in our index.js file, instead of what we had here with our /shop/real-viewer, what we're going to do is create a route with a path shop/:ID, and that will render our component item. I also need to import item. So I've imported item from component/item, and then our route path is going to our shop ID, shop/:ID, rendering the item component. This is a route parameter. ID is a route parameter. It will change. So that colon is what tells React Router that the ID is going to be a dynamic value. It will update. It could technically be a string. ID suggests that it's going to be a number. And then now, whenever we go to shop/ID, so I could put in / and ID up at the top. Nothing will render. So I have commented out all of this information. Let's put some skeleton code inside of our item just so we can check that, that it's working. So in our item component, item.js inside of components, right now we had an image. Let's, inside of our div for item title wrapper, we'll just add a string called tester. And we'll see, we'll see whenever we go to a shop / an ID, so I put the ID of 1, our item component is being rendered with the content tester inside. So as you can see, we're seeing the entire shop above the item. Again, this is where the exact comes in. So we want shop to only render when it is exactly /shop. Any of this other routes, so /shop/ID, we don't want our shop to show. We just want to see the individual item at this route. So I could change this currently to anything, and it will render tester. But we have now access to this parameter up here in the into the ID. So let's see what all gets passed into item now that we have it rendering on the screen. If we open this up into our little pop-out browser here and look at our components, we see that we have our router, browser router, and a bunch of links rendering at the top and a couple different route options. So here is our item component, and we'll see that item has a number of new props passed in. So even though we're just referencing item as a component in our route declaration and not explicitly passing props like we have been since last week, props are still being passed through. So something kind of magic is happening in React Router. React Router is taking our component and it's going to render our component for us, but it's going to pass its props into our component. So some props that it's passing into our item component are history, location, and match. So we're going to go over history and location on Thursday's class, but tonight we're going to focus on match. So match, as you can see, is an object. We can see that we have matched our URL. We can see the path that it matched to. So that was our /shop:/ID path. We can see what the URL actually is. So it's /shop/ and then my random letter string. We can also see our key here, params. So match is a prop. So props.match would get us this match object. And then our key on match, so props.match.params, we can see is also an object with a parameter ID equal to the content after my slash. So what's happening here is that we've created a keyword after this colon. So in our route declaration for /shop/:ID, ID will become a key inside of our params, inside of our match prop. So now that it's an ID, really bad pun, now that it is a key on our params, we can use that to access whatever data is after our slash. So we'll be doing this with items, and our items are unique by their IDs. So our IDs for our data list are numbers, not strings. So likely we would see a /4. And in our item, we'll go into our item props, match, params, and now we'll see that the ID has changed to 4. What we want to do is access this ID number so that we can use this number to find the rest of the item's information inside of our data array. So if you go back to our code, and we'll go inside of item, let's just print out our props.match.params.id. We'll see in our console log that our ID was equal to this, and now it is equal to 4. Yay. So now we have the param ID. Let's create that as a const so we can use it to reference. So we'll call that param item ID is equal to props.match.params.id. So right now we have a list of items that we can use. So I added those items into our shop, but let's also add them here. So we're going to import our items from our data file. And if we look at our items, console.log items, we will see an array of objects. Each object has an ID, a name, price, URL, description, and shipping. So items is an array of objects. What array function can I use to search items for this particular ID? So what array function can we use to search our items array of objects for our ID? So think about the use case here. Find, we got a map in there, filter, and find. Okay, so some of you have voted for find, some of you have voted for filter, and I saw a few shout outs for map. You could use find or filter. The preferable answer, in my opinion, is find, so that's what we're going to use today. Filter is, think of a filter as like when you're applying like for Airbnbs. I know every time I go on an Airbnb, I have to filter for Airbnbs that are pet friendly because my dog goes everywhere with me. That is a filter function. So I'm expecting hopefully many results back from Airbnb that are still pet friendly in that area that I'm searching for. A find is when you're looking for something specifically. So usually, actually, you're only supposed to get or expect one answer back from a find. Filter, you look for multiple. Find is focused for a single result. And so since we're finding based off of ID and IDs are unique identifiers, then that is why I prefer find versus a filter. A map is more commonly used if you're transforming data. So we're not doing any sort of transformation on our array of items. What we're just doing is we want to keep our array of items the same. We just want to find a particular item inside of that array. So that's a little breakdown of find versus filter. And important to know, map arrays, any sort of array functionality is heavily tested on JavaScript interviews because we use arrays all the time. So find, filters, maps, reduce, which I don't think you guys have gone over, but you'll get to. These are all things that are very, very common to be tested on. So kind of knowing the use cases are extremely important. So yeah, we have find or filter. If we did find, we would want to first, well, we're trying to find the item, so that's going to be our result of the find, right? So we're going to use our item here. We need our array, so that's the items array. And since it's array, we're going to call the find functionality here. If you hover over, they give a little bit more information about how to do it. They give way too much information. So the synthesis is you're going to return a function that will look at each item inside of the array, and then will return the item if an expression is true. So each item in the array, and it's a function, so it's looking at each item, and for each item, it will compare the item.id with, at this point, let's say param item ID. So this is the structure of a find function. You have a parameter, which looks at each element inside of your array, and it will return when the statement is true. If it's not true, then I think, if it's never true, then it returns null, I believe, or unidentified. And if it is true, then it will return the explicit item. If you had used a filter, and that's a good exercise to go back to, is do this exercise with the filter, it would return an array, and it would be an array of objects that fit this expression. Okay, so let's see what's happening here. We have undefined. Can anyone tell me why this is undefined? So why is item undefined? Quick answer. If you don't know, that's cool. Shrugging is appropriate. Question marks are appropriate. So we got some attempts. Ooh. Equals equals, not triple equals. Param's ID is a string. I have defined param item of D. It's up here. Yeah. So I'm pleasantly surprised because not many people catch on to this, but yes, this is correct. The param's ID, param ID, item ID is returning as a string, and item.id is a number. So David has suggested that we can use a double equals instead of a triple equals, which means if the things are the same, irregardless of type. So basically, like if one is a string 5 and one is a number 5, they look alike. So it's a soft comparison, and then this statement would be true with a double equals. Generally speaking, we should never use double equals because we're leaving it up to our browser to define what looks quote unquote alike. So to be explicit, we want to translate param ID into a number so that we're comparing a number to number here. So item ID is a number. Param item ID is currently a string. And if you want to see a breakdown of that, I break it down in our notes about a little bit more about those types there. Cool. So now look what we have. We've gone to our shop. We passed an ID of 5. We found that a param ID, so param item ID is equal to 5. Then we've iterated over our data, and we have found an item.id equal to 5. That is equal to the param item ID number, which is 5. So now you'll see in console.log item, we're returning a whole bunch of data for our item with the ID of 5. So if we wanted to see this, we can uncomment out. If you guys don't know this shorthand, it's command/ or control/. So you highlight over the line that has the brackets. And you can do command/. It's pretty magic. Or you can copy and paste from my browser. And now we see that when we go to shop 5, we have all the information for our ID of 5. If we change this ID to say 2, it will now render all of number 2, all of the item with the ID of number 2's information. So we can double check that by going to our data, and we'll see inside of our data, if we go down to our object with the ID of 2, we'll see that the name is the Shakespearean insults chart, which also seems like an amazing gift. And we can see the image and the description as well. Yay! So we actually have one more piece here, and then I can take a few questions and let you guys go early. Actually, I'll stop for questions now. yeah, I'll stop for questions now. So any questions? Just because that's a major concept. Any questions either in Slack or Slido? Around the tester part. Okay, Charisse, we can go back to that. So the tester part, that was a little bit beforehand. What the tester was doing was before we had an item. So if I go back here, so let me undo. Yeah, I'm undoing right now. Okay. Whoop. So what this is doing is right now we were focusing on setting up code. So sometimes what I do is I add in test code or test display. So I have something rendering on the screen. So I added tester here so that whenever we navigated to shop :ID with an ID instead of :ID, we would get something rendering on the screen. If I didn't have tester here, we'd still be navigating to this URL, and it is rendering, but there's nothing to render, just a bunch of empty divs. So I added in a little test code called tester so that we could test to see that our URL is rendering correctly. And then what we did is we went through our items array that we imported from our data file, found our particular item called item, and then uncommented some of this code that I had pre-written that renders the code. So then I just can remove the tester and the real image, H2, H4, and paragraph content render. I didn't point this out explicitly, but the item that we found from our items array is then used, it is an object, and we use dot notation to find these different items, these different content for our JSX. So if we look at our console log, our item is an object with all these key value pairs. So our item name, so like this H2 up here, is from item.name, which gets this content from the object. Same thing with price, 25.49, we get from this price decimal on the item object. So item.price gets 25.49. Gotcha. Did we link items from main page so we can render them? Not yet. We're going to do that as a last final step. Are there differences between exact path slash versus path slash exact? No, those are the same. What happens if you give it an invalid ID now? So item is coming back undefined, which is going to throw an error. So the first error here is item.undefined. So if you think that somebody would put in an invalid ID, you can handle that by saying if the item is rendered, then render this JSX. Otherwise, render a div that says 404, bad data, does not exist. And I just did that using a ternary. So if item is defined, so we were seeing currently item is undefined. So if it is undefined, then this is false. And in a ternary, we go down to the colon and we render the second condition, which is just a div. So when the item is true, you can it'll return an item and it'll render your JSX. So a quick little ternary there. ID was a string. Can you explain? I saw a number. Sure. We can look at here. If we have our param item ID, we can look at the type of the ID, and it says the type of the ID is a string versus console.log type of item.id. So item.id is coming from the data, and you can use the type of item.id to see that each item ID is coming back as a number. So there's a bigger breakdown inside of my notes if you are curious about different comparisons and whatnot. I can pull this over just to take a quick look at it. Here, this kind of breaks down what's coming back. So the data ID was our item.id, which is a number. Param item ID is a string that's both using the type of. And then our item found is undefined because we are comparing a number triple equals to a string, so that's false. However, if you use the double equals, it will be true because they look alike. Generally speaking, you do not want to use a double equals. That's considered bad practice because it is dependent on the browser's definition of what looks alike. So in order to be more explicit, we transform our param item ID into a number. To transform our item ID, we wrap it with the number prototype. Cool. So our last little bit for this evening is just so that we can be at our shop and click on one of these and have it navigate to its individual shop page. This is the last little bit for this evening. Sorry, I just closed my browser that I used to reference. Okay, so we are going to we're going to create links for our item data. And let's say when we are rendering our shop, we're using items.map. So we're iterating over each element inside of the array and rendering or getting that data and then rendering this little card for that item called item card. What we're going to do is make the whole card clickable. To do that, we're going to use the link component. So we'll have to import link. Let's go ahead and do that. Well, that's not link. We'll import curly braces link from React router DOM. So now we have the component. The link, what's going to happen is that we want to go to, just like we were doing with our nav links, we're going to use the two props of link. And we're going to create a dynamic route. So normally what we would do is write item, blah, 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 slash, slash, slash. But we want some of these elements inside of our URL to be dependent on the data coming from item. So that means we're going to have to use curly braces and use our string interpolation in order to reference part of the item. So our URL that we're working with is /shop/:ID. Let's start there. So we're going to wrap our whole card in a link, which basically means if we click anywhere inside of this card, it's going to trigger this link to fire, and our link is going to navigate to this URL. So now we can see that our entire card is clickable, and you can see that with a little pointer here. Let's click on the Yoga Joes. When I click here, I'm getting a 404 error, which means let's check out our URL. Something's gone wrong, right? We're not getting any items back. If we look at our URL specifically says shop/:ID. Now, we don't want to say /:ID. We want it to say shop/a number. That's how we get our ID out of it. So we, instead of saying ID, even though that's the name of our route, it's dynamic. It is a parameter. We need to pass it data. So we need to get the item's ID and pass that instead. That's where the backticks come in hand, because inside of our link to prop, we can use the money sign curly braces to get our item.id, which is the ID of the item, so that when we're in a shop and we click on this avocado tree starter, the item ID 6 is found inside of the item object that rendered the link. So when I click it, it then uses that item's ID to generate this URL, shop/6. And then this parameter can be used in order to find our item data. Yay! All right, that's the last little bit that I have for you guys tonight. We build off of this on Thursday. So make sure you understand everything that's happening along here, specifically with your links and your routes, why you create routes versus why you create links. We'll be adding on to our component functionality next week with like some sub navigation and whatnot. So tonight's homework is very similar to what we did here, but we'll be adding on to it on Thursday. Just wanted to check. Yep, no other questions. I will post notes to this if you want more information on the routing, or if you want more information on route parameters. I do include some extra links in there, plus a breakdown of me going through the different types. Feel free to look over it. It mostly follows what we did today. I also included an example for using filter versus find if you want to spend a little bit more time practicing your array methods. But that's all for me tonight, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Have a wonderful evening.